Hello, and warm welcome to Holy Trinity Church in Maisons-Laffitte. You have reached us at the end of summer. It's the very, very first day of September, and we hope you've had a wonderful summer and are looking forward to what we call in France the rentrée, coming back, whatever that means for you. For us here, we're going to start some new sermons, and the focus for today is from the epistle reading, James chapter 1, verses 17 to 27. If you'd like to give those a read. Well, as it's been the last week of summer, that means that me and my husband have been trying to finally do some of those things in the garden that we've been meaning to get to for 2 months. You know how that is. So we were out and about, and our next door neighbor had the same idea, obviously, but here's a rude and slightly embarrassing shock. Our neighbor was hacking away at overgrown ivy from our garden, coming over the wall into her garden. Oh my goodness. The cringe, the shame, the horror that this vigorous ivy, which we kind of thought of as covering a slightly unsightly concrete wall, was instead destroying the wall and creating a massive headache for our neighbor. Well, that made us take a really good look at the rest of the garden and see some kind of hidden, out of the way things that were also very much in need of attention. We found ourselves thinking, when did that happen? How did these creepers and vines produce dozens of meters, I'm not exaggerating, of winding, weighty mess? Yeah. Well, anyway, I realize that gardening isn't a topic that resonates with everyone. I mean, anyone in an apartment is feeling either tremendously smug for having avoided such worries, or maybe slightly resentful that I would dare to voice such a privileged first world problem. I get it. But agrarian images do fill the pages of the Gospels, and that's what I ended up thinking as I was, looking at the ivy and pulling at it. Jesus, there's a reason Jesus loved to use them as metaphors. Looking at the damage of a year's, summer's growth of ivy, the word ruthless is what sprung to mind. Weeds are ruthlessly aggressive. They're not easily discouraged. They spring back, and so in order to root them out, we have to be equally ruthless. And from today's reading in James, we have a reminder of what one of those weeds of our heart that we have to be constantly vigilant of and absolutely ruthless is. Verses 19, 20, and 26, the weed of human anger and an undisciplined tongue. I already feel convicted. It says, "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless." Well, say what you think, James. Oh my goodness. Well, there we go. Quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry. Yeah, well, that sorted out my heart weed of human anger, right? Boom, sorted. Ha! The next 4 Sundays will include readings from James. We won't preach on all of them, but they are useful reminders of some of the very practical truths of what our lives should look like when we live together as Christians. The challenge in these teachings, though, I find, is to get behind and underneath them to find out how we can make these changes that we agree with James we ought to make. Because just hearing "be slow to anger," well, that's not enough, is it? Anger is an emotion that either kind of springs up in us as a sudden burst of heat, or bubbles insidiously deep beneath the surface, tainting what we say and do, almost without us realizing that actually our simmering rage has become and is visible to others. Anger. As Christians, it's not something that we're comfortable with it, and if I could, I would avoid preaching on it. But it is mentioned something like in 800 verses in the Bible, so I suppose we should just give it a few minutes. So let's think this morning very quickly about maybe why we avoid anger, what is good anger, and would I be open to having God reshape my emotions? So why do we avoid anger? Ooh, Pastor Tim Keller says in his talk, The Healing of Anger, which I do recommend to you, that anger is an emotion that we as Christians really don't want to admit. We'll talk about frustration, being upset, fear, worry, sadness, love, hope, but anger, yeah, not so much. Often we're scared of it, and one of the reasons is because we can feel what it does to us. Anger is deeply destructive of our own mental health and our bodies. It's more destructive, apparently, than anxiety, extreme sorrow, or physical exertion. And it creates high blood pressure, headaches, damage to our hearts, brains, and gastrointestinal systems. There was just a new article on that in the Wall Street Journal. Well, we can also fear it and shy away from it because we've been hurt in the past by the anger of others. And as Christians, well, we've been taught to turn the other cheek, haven't we? And so we assume that we mustn't ever feel anger, no matter what happens. Maybe we even have some notion that, well, the God of the Old Testament was an angry God, prone to random or excessive outbursts. Whereas the God of the New Testament, well, he's meek and mild and never felt or showed anger. Well, if this is the case, we will really struggle with guilt when we feel hints or hits of anger welling up in the pit of our stomach. And yet, we don't really need to be burdened with such notions because the Bible talks an awful lot about a good anger. Our God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and he describes himself as a God who is slow to anger, but he does anger. He was not in the Old Testament some out-of-control power lord, and since Jesus, he has not been a passionless, indifferent God. And he doesn't expect us in his image to be either. To either be slaves to capricious emotions or devoid of emotions. He does expect us, though, to offer up our messed up affections and passions to him. Because anger can be good. Not just neutral, but good. Not just negative, but good. Paul wrote to the Ephesians in chapter 4, he said, be angry, but do not sin. Or in the Message, they wrote, go ahead and be angry. In fact, you do well to be angry, but do not use your anger as fuel for revenge and do not stay angry. Think about it. It would be terrible to live in a world where God isn't angry at sin, if he isn't angry at injustice, if he doesn't get angry when the vulnerable are abused with impunity. Terrible, right? Now, let me share something that I'm indebted to the Reverend Christopher Ashe and Pastor Steve Midgley that they wrote about in their book, The Heart of Anger. They point something out so clearly that I've kind of had in my mind, but boy, they said it really well. God's anger and Jesus' anger, we can see, stems from three forms of anger. Either being extremely angry at the hardness of heart of those in his temple, or angry because God is dishonored, or angry at the effects of sin. Jesus exhibited anger to all those things. You can go find it. By contrast, Jesus showed no trace of anger when he personally suffered injustice. Isn't that amazing? When Jesus suffered the massive injustices of that kangaroo court trial and the gross miscarriage of justice in his death sentence that was given to satisfy a mob, there's no anger. There's no welling up. There's no red face. There's no harsh words. No. Jesus' anger was reserved for those other things. Good anger is zealous for God's honor. Good anger flows from not being indifferent to the injustice suffered by others, or the powerlessness of, or the suffering of those who are powerless and most vulnerable. Good anger, like James says, comes after much listening and very restrained speech on our part. In fact, we'll hear in a couple of weeks, but you could peek ahead to James chapter 3, that a godly expression of frustration and anger never takes the shape of unrestrained speech. So, how do I get my emotions reshaped? How do we get to the point of good anger and healthy expression of it? Well, somebody who's been on a lifelong journey of trying to reshape or let God reshape my heart so it doesn't destroy me and those I love, let me just first say it takes a long time. And we also probably need a motivation to change, don't we? Depending on who we are, we may be more motivated to change because we know that our sinful anger deeply dishonors God. Or maybe we're motivated because we know that our out of control anger is damaging us, our mental health or physical health. Or maybe we're motivated because we know that our either explosive or simmering anger is damaging relationships with the people who are dearest to us. It doesn't really matter, does it? The motivation, because the solution to all three of those starts with the same first step. It's very simply to come to God with a prayer that I'm going to say now. And if you'd like to close your eyes and pray it in your heart as I say it, go ahead and do that. It's simply to say, I can't do this, Lord, but I do desperately want to be different. I give you my heart. Please reshape my emotions into good and healthy ones. Remind me when I need to pause and listen. Show me the anger I need to let go of. Show me the anger I need to embrace. I pray in Jesus' powerful and holy name. Amen. Have a blessed week, everyone.